On the morning of January 28, 1986, the Kennedy Space Center in Florida woke up under an unusual condition for space launches: intense cold. Overnight temperatures had dropped below freezing, something extremely rare for the region. Even so, the Space Shuttle Challenger stood on the launch pad, ready to carry out mission STS-51L, considered at the time just another step in NASA's ambitious space program. For the public, this was not an ordinary launch. For the first time, a civilian would be part of the crew. Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher, had been selected from thousands of applicants to represent the Teacher in Space project. The goal was simple yet powerful: to bring space exploration closer to everyday people, especially children, who would watch lessons broadcast directly from space. Schools across the United States turned on their televisions that morning, transforming the launch into a national event. Challenger carried 7 highly trained crew members, experienced professionals who fully trusted the engineering behind that colossal machine. Risk had always been part of spaceflight, but it was believed to be within acceptable limits. The Space Shuttle program had been presented as safe, reusable, and reliable, almost a natural evolution of commercial aviation. The idea that something could go seriously wrong that day seemed distant to those watching from home. However, behind the cameras, there was a quiet atmosphere of tension. Engineers, technicians, and specialists knew this was not a routine launch. The cold represented a critical factor for sensitive system components, especially within the solid rocket boosters. Internal reports had already pointed to serious risks associated with low temperatures, but this information never reached the public, and worse, it was being downplayed within NASA's own decision-making structure. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this content and want to understand how massive projects can fail in catastrophic ways, subscribe now to the Wrong Project channel and leave a comment sharing what you already knew or didn't know about the Challenger disaster. Your engagement helps the channel grow and brings these stories to more people. At 11:38 a.m. local time, the engines ignited. Challenger began its ascent, leaving a trail of fire and smoke across the sky. During the first few seconds, everything appeared completely normal. The live broadcast showed a flawless launch, perfectly within expected parameters. No alarms, no immediate explosion, no clear sign of failure. That normality is exactly what made what happened next so shocking. What almost no one knew at that moment was that from the very first instance after ignition, an invisible failure was already underway. A small, silent, and seemingly insignificant failure that within seconds would end not only the Challenger mission, but also the illusion that advanced technology is immune to human error, political pressure, and flawed judgment. To understand why the Challenger disaster happened, we need to go back several years and examine the very conception of the Space Shuttle program. In the early 1970s, NASA faced a difficult situation. Public enthusiasm for the space race had declined after the Apollo missions, and the agency's budget was under constant pressure. To survive politically, NASA needed a project that appeared indispensable, cost-effective, and innovative at the same time. It was within this context that the idea of the Space Shuttle was born, a reusable vehicle capable of launching like a rocket, operating in orbit like a spacecraft, and landing like an airplane. The official narrative promised to drastically reduce mission costs and allow frequent, almost routine launches. The problem was that to meet these promises, the project had to accept dangerous engineering compromises from the very beginning. One of the most critical compromises involved the use of solid rocket boosters, known as SRBs. Unlike liquid-fueled engines, solid rocket boosters cannot be shut down once ignited. Once the burn begins, there is no way to stop it. Even so, they were chosen because they were cheaper and easier to manufacture at scale, and because they satisfied political and industrial requirements imposed on the program. These boosters were built from cylindrical segments joined by mechanical joints. Inside each joint, small rubber rings, the infamous O-rings, had the crucial job of sealing the extremely hot gases generated during ignition. In theory, the system worked. In practice, it depended on very specific conditions to operate safely, especially when it came to temperature. From the earliest shuttle flights, warning signs began to appear. Engineers observed erosion and damage to the O-rings after several launches, indicating that hot gases were partially escaping through the joints. These events were labeled as acceptable anomalies, a dangerous expression that became common within NASA's organizational culture. Instead of recognizing these signs as clear warnings of a serious problem, they were gradually normalized. This process, later known as normalization of deviance, created a false sense of security. Each successful flight reinforced the belief that the system was reliable, even when technical data suggested otherwise. Slowly, engineering adapted to the failures instead of correcting them definitively. By the time Challenger was prepared for the 1986 mission, the program already carried a dangerous legacy of rushed decisions, political pressure, and technical compromises. The disaster did not begin on launch day. It was built slowly, meeting after meeting, report after report, every time physical reality was placed behind external expectations. At the center of the Challenger tragedy was an apparently simple, inexpensive, and discreet component: the O-ring. At first glance, it was just a rubber ring designed to seal metal joints. However, within the context of a solid rocket booster, this small item carried an enormous responsibility. It was the final barrier between superheated gases reaching temperatures above 3,000 degrees Celsius and the vehicle's external structure. The Space Shuttle's solid rocket boosters were assembled from multiple cylindrical segments stacked vertically. Between each segment was a joint, and within these joints were installed two O-rings, known as the primary and secondary seals. The logic was simple. If the first failed, the second would provide the seal. However, this redundancy only worked if both rings were properly positioned and, above all, flexible enough to respond instantly to internal pressure at ignition. The major issue was that the O-rings were made from a type of rubber highly sensitive to temperature. In cold conditions, the material lost elasticity, becoming stiff and slow to deform. During booster ignition, internal pressure rose abruptly. If the O-ring did not expand quickly enough to seal the joint, hot gases would escape through small gaps, initiating a process of progressive erosion. This behavior had already been observed in previous launches. In several flights, engineers found clear signs of erosion on the O-rings after the shuttle landed. In some cases, the secondary ring was nearly compromised, meaning the system had come dangerously close to catastrophic failure. These findings were documented, recorded in technical reports, and presented during internal meetings. Despite this, the severity of the problem was consistently underestimated, not because engineers failed to understand the risk, but because the organizational structure made it difficult for these concerns to reach the highest levels of decision-making. The apparently successful performance of earlier missions created the illusion that the system was safe, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Another critical factor was the lack of proper testing at low temperatures. The O-rings had never been certified to operate in conditions as cold as those forecast for the Challenger launch. Still, there was no officially defined minimum temperature that would automatically prohibit a launch. This technical gap allowed dangerous interpretations and decisions driven more by convenience than safety. The fundamental error was not merely designing a component vulnerable to cold, but accepting that vulnerability as normal. Over time, Risk stopped being treated as an urgent threat and became viewed as part of normal operations. When that happens, disaster is no longer a remote possibility. It becomes only a matter of time. On the night of January 27, 1986, just hours before the Challenger launch, one of the most important and most ignored meetings in modern engineering history took place. Engineers from Morton Thiokol, the company responsible for the solid rocket boosters, were deeply concerned about the sharp drop in temperature forecast for the following morning. Predictions indicated temperatures lower than any previous space shuttle launch. These engineers were not speculating. Their concerns were based on real data from previous flight analyses. Charts, reports, and technical records showed a clear correlation between low temperatures and increased O-ring erosion. The colder it got, the greater the risk of seal failure. To them, launching Challenger under those conditions was not just risky, it was unacceptable. During the teleconference between Morton Thiokol and NASA representatives, the engineers formally recommended delaying the launch. This recommendation was neither vague nor emotional. It was a technical position grounded in evidence. They stated there was insufficient data to ensure that the O-rings would function properly at the predicted temperatures. In other words, they could not guarantee crew safety. NASA's response was immediate and revealing. Instead of requesting further analysis or seeking to better understand the risk, some managers questioned the basis of the recommendation. They asked for definitive proof that the launch would fail, completely reversing the logic of safety. In engineering, the fundamental principle is that the absence of proof of danger does not equal proof of safety. Yet this distinction was ignored. Under intense pressure, Morton Thiokol's leadership requested a break in the meeting. Engineers were temporarily excluded from the discussion while company executives deliberated internally. The atmosphere changed. Technical concern gave way to commercial, contractual, and political considerations. The company relied heavily on NASA contracts, and defying the agency could have serious consequences. When the meeting resumed, the position had changed. Morton Thiokol withdrew its recommendation to delay and approved the launch. This decision was not accompanied by new data, new tests, or additional analysis. It was simply a signature on a document authorizing the mission to proceed. That moment marked a critical breaking point. For the first time, a vital engineering decision was made directly against the judgment of the technical experts closest to the problem. The silence that followed was not merely symbolic. It represented the defeat of engineering by hierarchy, schedule pressure, and the demand to meet deadlines. That night, the Challenger disaster ceased to be a distant possibility and became an accepted potential outcome. When the sun rose the next morning, the fate of the mission had already been sealed, long before engine ignition. On the morning of January 28, 1986, Challenger left the launch pad exactly on schedule. To those watching live, everything appeared normal. The roar of the engines, the release of the restraints, and the slow, majestic ascent of the space shuttle conveyed a sense of complete success. Yet from the very first moments after ignition, something had already gone wrong, though almost no one could see it. At the exact moment the solid rocket boosters ignited, internal pressure rose violently. This was the critical instant when the O-rings were supposed to deform rapidly, sealing the joints between the booster segments. However, due to the extremely low temperature that morning, the primary O-ring on the right booster was too stiff to respond quickly enough. The seal partially failed. High-speed cameras, analyzed later, captured small puffs of black smoke escaping from the right booster joint in the first seconds of flight. That smoke was a clear sign of superheated gases leaking from the structure. In the initial moments, the leak appeared to temporarily seal itself, possibly due to the buildup of combustion byproducts. This false stabilization contributed to the illusion that the problem had resolved on its own. As Challenger gained altitude and speed, extreme aerodynamic forces began acting on the vehicle's structure. The combination of vibration, pressure, and structural flexing reopened the failure in the right booster joint. This time, the leak became a continuous, focused flame, invisible to the naked eye during flight, but fatal in its consequences. That flame directly struck the external fuel tank, which stored liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Within seconds, the tank's structure began to weaken. There was no instantaneous explosion caused by direct ignition, but rather a catastrophic loss of structural integrity. When the tank failed, the entire space shuttle system was subjected to aerodynamic forces it could not withstand. At 73 seconds into the flight, Challenger disintegrated in mid-air. What the public perceived as a massive fireball was, in reality, the violent separation of system components, followed by the release of fuel. The vehicle ceased to exist as a functional spacecraft in a fraction of a second. For flight controllers and engineers monitoring the mission, the shock was immediate. No emergency procedure could be applied at that point. The failure had occurred too quickly and at an irreversible structural level. In just over 1 minute, decades of technological development, billions of dollars in investment, and 7 human lives were lost. The 73 seconds of Challenger became a brutal symbol of how small failures, when combined with poor decisions, can produce irreversible consequences. It was not a sudden mistake, but the inevitable outcome of a chain of choices made long before that day. When Challenger disintegrated in the skies over Florida, the impact of the disaster immediately went far beyond engineering and technology. For the first time, a space accident of such magnitude was broadcast live to millions of people, including children in classrooms. The emotional shock was instant, profound, and long-lasting. It was not just the loss of a spacecraft or a program, but the death of 7 people in front of the entire world. The Challenger crew was not composed solely of highly trained astronauts. Each member carried a personal story, a family, and a specific purpose within the mission. Francis Dick Scobie, the commander, was an experienced pilot and Air Force veteran. Michael Smith, the pilot, was flying his first space mission. Ronald McNair was a physicist, a talented musician, and a symbol of inspiration for young scientists. Ellison Onizuka represented diversity within the American space program. Judith Resnick and Gregory Jarvis contributed essential technical expertise, and Krista McAuliffe represented something entirely new. Krista McAuliffe's presence turned the launch into an educational and emotional event. She was not just an astronaut in training, she was a teacher representing thousands of educators and millions of students. Her mission was to teach lessons from space, to show that science was not distant from everyday life. When Challenger was lost, that symbol of hope turned into collective trauma, especially for children who believed they were witnessing a positive historic moment. The astronauts' families watched the launch from designated areas at the Kennedy Space Center. For them, what should have been a moment of immense pride became shock, confusion, and silence. There was no warning, no time to process. In a matter of seconds, lives were abruptly ended, leaving a void impossible to fill. The psychological impact of the disaster also deeply affected NASA professionals. Engineers, technicians, and flight controllers began living with feelings of guilt and self-questioning. Many knew they had raised concerns before the launch. Others realized too late that they had accepted risks that should never have been normalized. Trust in the institution was shaken, both internally and in the eyes of the public. The Challenger disaster changed how society viewed the space program. The belief that cutting-edge technology was infallible was shattered on live television. More than a technical failure, the accident revealed the human cost of flawed organizational decisions. Behind every ignored report and minimized warning, there were real people who paid the highest possible price. Within hours of the Challenger disaster, NASA immediately suspended all space shuttle flights. Public shock, international attention, and the severity of the tragedy made it impossible to downplay what had happened. It was clear that this was not a simple operational accident. Something was fundamentally wrong with the way decisions were being made within the American Space Agency. The US government quickly established an independent investigation body, officially known as the Rogers Commission. Its purpose was clear: identify the technical causes of the accident and, more importantly, understand how a system filled with prior warnings could reach such a tragic outcome. The commission brought together engineers, scientists, military officials, and public figures, including renowned physicist Richard Feynman. From the earliest testimonies, it became evident that the problem went far beyond an isolated mechanical failure. Engineers from Morton Thiokol testified under oath that they had recommended delaying the launch due to low temperatures. Internal documents, memos, and meeting records confirmed that the risks associated with the O-rings had been known for years. The failure was not a lack of information, but how that information was handled. Richard Feynman played a decisive role in exposing the gap between institutional narrative and technical reality. In one of the most iconic public hearings, he demonstrated in a simple and direct way how the O-ring material lost elasticity when exposed to cold. By placing a rubber ring in ice water, Feynman proved something engineers already knew but managers had ignored: physics does not adapt to schedules. The conclusions of the Rogers Commission were devastating to NASA's image. The final report pointed to severe failures in the agency's organizational culture, highlighting pressure for frequent launches, poor communication across hierarchical levels, and a tendency to downplay known risks. The commission stated that NASA had developed a system in which safety warnings were diluted as they moved up the chain of command. One of the report's most powerful statements summarized the core issue. For a technology to succeed, reality must take precedence over public relations. This exposed the conflict between engineering and management, showing that technical decisions had been subordinated to political, financial, and institutional image concerns. The investigation also revealed that the concept of acceptable risk had been distorted over time. Unrealistic failure probabilities were presented to managers, creating a false sense of absolute control. In practice, the system operated far closer to its limits than officially acknowledged. In the end, the Rogers Commission made it clear that the Challenger disaster was not caused solely by a defective O-ring, but by a series of organizational decisions that silenced engineering voices. The truth emerged painfully. The accident was preventable, and its primary cause was human. The Challenger disaster did not end when the debris fell into the Atlantic Ocean. In fact, that moment marked the beginning of a series of deep and long-lasting consequences that would affect the US space program for many years. The financial, technological, and institutional impact of the accident was enormous, revealing the true cost of ignoring technical warnings in highly complex projects. Immediately after the disaster, the Space Shuttle program was completely grounded. All launches were suspended for nearly 3 years, while NASA conducted investigations, redesigned systems, and attempted to regain the trust of the government and the public. During this period, scientific, military, and commercial missions were cancelled or indefinitely delayed, creating a cascading effect across multiple sectors that depended on access to space. From a financial perspective, the losses were massive. Billions of dollars were spent on the accident investigation, debris recovery, booster redesign, and the implementation of new safety protocols. In addition, the loss of Challenger itself represented a wasted investment of enormous proportions. Each space shuttle cost billions of dollars to build, not counting decades of research and development behind it. NASA also faced severe political consequences. The U.S. Congress began exercising much stricter oversight over the agency, demanding detailed justification for every technical and budgetary decision. The narrative that the Space Shuttle was a routine, safe, and low-cost system was permanently dismantled. NASA's image as an infallible organization was replaced by a more critical and skeptical perception. Another significant effect was the complete reassessment of the program's promises. Before Challenger, NASA spoke of dozens of launches per year. After the accident, it became clear that such a pace was unrealistic and dangerous. The Space Shuttle came to be treated as a highly complex experimental system requiring extreme caution, which further increased operational costs per mission. Beyond the direct losses, the disaster had a major impact on the aerospace industry as a whole. Contractors saw projects cancelled, contracts renegotiated, and entire teams dismantled. Trust from international partners was also shaken, forcing NASA to renegotiate agreements and redefine its role in global space cooperation. The cost of Challenger's failure cannot be measured solely in dollars. It was reflected in scientific delays, lost opportunities, and a significant setback to American space ambitions. The accident demonstrated that organizational failures can be just as costly as technical ones, if not more. Over the years, the Challenger disaster has evolved from a tragic moment in space history into one of the most important case studies in the world for engineering, risk management, and professional ethics. Universities, companies, and government institutions began analyzing the accident not only to understand what failed technically, but to comprehend how complex organizations can create environments where serious errors become inevitable. One of the main lessons from Challenger is that engineering does not exist in isolation. Technical decisions are constantly influenced by external factors such as schedule pressure, budget constraints, and political expectations. When these pressures begin to outweigh technical data, safety becomes vulnerable. The Challenger case showed that ignoring or softening critical information can be just as dangerous as a calculation error. Another fundamental lesson involves internal communication. Within the Space Shuttle program, information about real risks was diluted as it moved up the organizational hierarchy. What began as a serious warning at the technical level reached managers as a minor issue, often presented in ambiguous language or overly optimistic statistics. This phenomenon created a dangerous disconnect between those who understood the risk and those with decision-making authority. Professional ethics also plays a central role in this story. Many engineers knew that launching at such low temperatures posed significant danger. Still, their recommendations were ignored or reversed. The ethical dilemma arises when professionals are pressured to accept decisions that contradict their technical judgment. Challenger exposed the cost of environments where questioning authority or insisting on safety is seen as an obstacle rather than a responsibility. The concept of normalization of deviance, widely discussed after the accident, became one of the most important contributions of this case to modern engineering. Small failures that do not immediately result in disaster begin to be seen as acceptable. Over time, safety standards shift, and what was once unacceptable becomes normal. Challenger demonstrated how dangerous this silent process can be. These lessons are not limited to space exploration. They apply to bridges, dams, nuclear plants, transportation systems, and any project where failure can cost human lives. The Challenger disaster serves as a permanent reminder that safety is not a technical detail, but a daily organizational choice. When analyzing the accident, it becomes clear that preventing similar tragedies requires more than advanced technology. It requires a culture that values transparency, listens to experts, and places physical reality above political or financial goals. This may be the greatest legacy left by Challenger. The Space Shuttle Challenger disaster was not just a tragic chapter in NASA's history. It became a definitive milestone about the limits of engineering when confronted with flawed human decisions. Decades later, the accident is remembered not for what technology failed to do, but for what people chose to ignore. Physics never failed Challenger. The equations were correct. The laws of thermodynamics, material mechanics, and structural dynamics behaved exactly as expected. What failed was the human interpretation of those data, and, more importantly, the willingness to act on them. The belief that nothing had gone wrong before proved to be a fatal trap. Past success was used to justify accepting increasingly dangerous risks. Challenger's legacy also exposed a common mistake in large projects: confusing complexity with control. Highly sophisticated systems create the illusion of total mastery, when in reality they increase dependence on correct decisions at every level. When a single link in that chain fails, the consequences can be irreversible. Challenger proved that no amount of redundancy can compensate for a culture that silences technical warnings. After the accident, NASA implemented significant changes in safety processes, communication, and decision-making. The solid rocket boosters were redesigned, new launch criteria were established, and technical channels gained more autonomy. Even so, the lesson came at the highest possible cost. No institutional improvement can erase the fact that 7 lives were lost unnecessarily. Challenger also delivered a message that goes far beyond aerospace. It speaks directly to engineers, managers, policymakers, and anyone involved in high-risk decisions. Whenever schedules are prioritized over safety, whenever technical warnings are treated as obstacles, the same pattern repeats itself. The story changes, the context changes, but the fundamental error remains. Perhaps the harshest lesson of Challenger is this: disasters rarely happen because of complete ignorance. They happen when people know the risk and choose to live with it. When engineering stops being a tool for protection and becomes a tool to justify decisions already made, failure becomes only a matter of time. Challenger did not just break apart in the skies over Florida, it shattered the idea that large projects fail by accident. Its legacy is a permanent warning that, in engineering, reality always wins, no matter the reputation, the budget, or the urgency. Physics does not negotiate, does not forgive, and does not forget. And that is perhaps the essence of every wrong project.